I'm going to tell you about Drew Martinez, which is the fantastic owner of the fantastic nursery Carnivoro. And this is the story behind the man and the man behind the nursery. So by the time Drew was in high school, he had his first greenhouse for the carnivorous plants. And his love for plants started when he had a visit to none other than California Carnivorous, which is about over 22 years ago. With the help of his family, who were well versed in carpentry, electrical engineering, and skilled electricians and builders, Drew was able to build a greenhouse that was the source of his initial education in the growing of carnivorous plants. Due to the unrelenting heat of Arizona where he resided, Drew admits to having killed many of his first plants. I'm so glad I'm not the only one, which led him to becoming curious about designing habitats for biology. So he began to study thermal physics. And Drew went on to study physics and biology at Stanford University, where he was introduced to many experimental microbiology techniques. For his master's thesis in optical sciences at the University of Arizona, LEDs were just recently hitting the market. So he focused on evaluating their efficacy versus industry standards for horticultural applications. Drew has seen in natural habitat, if I'm not mistaken, over 20 species of Nepenthes, with the famous, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Qian Li. In 2010, Drew decided to undertake the very difficult task of opening a carnivorous plant nursery, specializing in the breeding and the promoting of the very best of genetics available. And it is his hope that the wild populations will be under less pressure from poaching threats because line-bred material will simply be superior. Drew also hopes to breed plants for a wider clientele than the dedicated hobbyists with greenhouses or grow racks. I, for one, would love to walk into a supermarket and find a beautiful striped veitchi right there that we can just keep at regular household temperatures and without any special equipment. And so at this point, I think Drew and John, you guys are going to try to get Drew to screen share so that he can take over the meeting at this point.
Okay, yeah. So I'm gonna stop my little slideshow and my screen share. Drew, I made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen now. Yep, you're good to go.
Drew, did you unmute yourself?
There we go. That's what I asked. Okay, can everybody hear me all right?
You're a go, Drew.
Yes.
Yeah, you can hear me all right? Okay. Just wanted to make sure. Okay.
Yeah, we got you.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about lighting for carnivorous plants today. And this work has been ongoing for quite a while. I did my master's thesis back in 2014, evaluating LEDs for horticulture. And then ever since, I've been working with a lot more experiments on individual plants and then keeping up with all the things that are going on in the industry. It's a rapidly evolving field, so it keeps things exciting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about photosynthesis, at least some of the fundamentals that we'll keep in mind. And then I'm going to discuss some of the industry standard lighting metrics that are used currently. We'll do a comparison of light sources. I've got some Genera specific lighting recommendations. We'll do a breakdown of a cost comparison, and then I'll show some specific specific examples of lighting responses in Nepenthes veitchi. So light is an electromagnetic wave. It propagates through the air and through other media. The most important part of this that we're going to be talking about is the visible light spectrum, which is the most active for photosynthesis. Now, I'm going to refer to light as both a particle and a wave. It's important to know that it can be both at the same time. And the unit of light that is a particle is called a photon. Between 400 and 700 nanometers is both where plants use light for photosynthesis and where we can see with our eyes. So here's a very detailed graphic about photosynthesis. So won't go into too much detail other than the fact that there's two main sections in photosynthesis. There's a light reaction where you input light and water and then outspits oxygen. And also you get energy out of that as well. So you get phosphorylation of ADP to ATP, and then also a reduction of another molecule. And then that goes into a cycle that doesn't need light. It's called the Calvin cycle, and it's dark. And that's where that energy that came from the photons turns into sugars that are more stable to be stored long term. And so the dark cycle requires CO2 coming in. And one of the most interesting things that I find is the most abundant enzyme on the planet is this one that's abbreviated RUBP called ribisco, which is necessary for making sugars for plants. Anyway, and this is a cyclic reaction. It just it goes round and round. So this is one part that's really awesome to me. This is the receiving of a photon. So a photon will come in, and plants have these, they're called antenna complexes. And a photon will come into the complex, and these are pigments right here, all these little individual things we see here. And the photon will hit a pigment, and then it will excite an electron, and that electron will just start bouncing around within the pigment. And it's trying to make its way to the bottom of the well, which is this reaction center here. You know, it goes from, say, like a blue receptor, which receives like blue light, which is the highest energy, all the way down to like red receptors, which are closer to the center. I guess the key to that it might be applicable to what we'll be talking about later is these reactions are in a cascade. They happen really quickly, but while they're happening, there's actually potential for some damage through here. And that's kind of where we can see some issues with growing plants and overexposing them. You know, oftentimes the damage will happen here after photons excite an electron and it's bouncing around, and there's a lot of oxidative and reduced species here. Let's see, let me, whoop. Here we go. So these specific pigments right here, they are chlorophyll, or at least the green ones are supposed to be chlorophyll, and then there's some other ones here that also absorb light. And so right here is a graph of a lot of these different pigments working together, or well, displayed individually. And they absorb photons based on the wavelength of light coming in. You know, so chlorophyll B here is peaked, you know, at this specific wavelength. There's other pigments that will pick up photons at other wavelengths. So a lot of people have the misconception that plants don't use any green light. And you'll see here, like, there's no pigment that really peaks right here in the green, which is somewhere around like 550 nanometers. But actually what happens is green light penetrates further. It's not particularly efficiently absorbed by any one pigment, but as it goes through, it will get picked up by pigments like deeper inside the plant. And so over here on the right, this is the overall photosynthetic action spectra. So this is what type of, or this is light getting absorbed as it makes its way through the plant. And you see that across this this curve, like from 400 nanometers to like 700 nanometers, there's pretty high action for all the photons that are going through. And so this brings us here to this graph where I want to make sure we distinguish what is photosynthetically active radiation, PAR, and what it is luminous efficacy, which is what our eyes respond to. So in this graph, you see this kind of bell curve shape. That is a graph of luminous efficiency, which is how well our eyes respond to a certain wavelength of light. So you see it peaks in the green, but it falls down very strongly in the red and the blue. And so, just because vision is such an important part of our daily lives, most optical systems are designed to measure this metric, where when we're looking at plants, we want to capture everything that's benefiting the plant, which is a wider spectrum, so everywhere from 400 to 700 nanometers in this case, where the plant is able to photosynthesize all those photons. So where there's equivalent metrics for vision versus for horticulture for photosynthesis. So where we have luminous efficiency right here, photosynthetically active radiation is the equivalent of where we have lumens. People talk about lumens for illumination. We have this other metric, which I will go into more detail later, is a photosynthetic photon flux. And then we have lux, or the old school way to measure that is foot candles. And then the equivalent is photosynthetic photon flux density. That's a measurement per area. Now, here's an example of how we measure photosynthetic photon flux. Just think of us having a bucket underneath every photon that lands between 400 and 700 nanometers. Everything outside of that isn't counted, but everything that is inside that range falls into the bucket, and those just get counted up. And then we generally, there's a lot of photons going in to make, in our everyday lives. So we use units of micromoles per second, where a mole is 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd. That's Avogadro's number. So the way to measure this is you take a light source and you put it in the middle of this gigantic integrating sphere that's big enough to fit a person. These are pretty costly, actually. They're not real common to see, so it's actually kind of a hard measurement to make. But this is the true way that you can figure out the number of photons coming out, or micromoles per second, is what our PPF metric is. So if you take that PPF, which I just described, and then you divide that by the amount of power you had to put into the light, you get photosynthetic photon efficiency. And we'll be referring to that. That just basically tells us how efficient we are at generating photons from our electrons coming out of the wall socket. There's another thing we need to talk about, light spreads. And this is just a fact of life. No matter how much you try to get light to collimate, it will spread no matter what. Right here, we've got an example of a point source. And you can see as it goes out, the same number of rays are leaving that point source, but those rays are spreading out. You just assume that as you get further away from a source of light, it's going to be more spread. So it's going to cover more area, but in all places, it's going to be less intense. So right here, I've got a map of photosynthetic flux density, which is the amount of photosynthetic flux hitting a given spot. So right here, we've got a light. It's a standard 4-foot form factor. And the light on the left is only 6 inches above the surface that it's aimed at. And you can see, in this case, the stuff in the middle, is really bright. Whereas, if you go, to the larger rectangles that are not as dark, you can see like what the footprint of those are. And if you go out to like, say, a 6x4 area around that light, you're going to get almost no light. But if you back up, or if you move the light up, like say away from that surface, you're going to get it more evenly spread. So, and this measurement right here is counted in micromoles per second per meter squared. So it's a count of a number of photons coming through in a given time for a given area. So this is measured with a spectrometer. So you're not measuring a total power, you're just measuring a single point. And you're correcting for the angle that it's coming in. So these spectrometers are really expensive, like even though it's basic spectrometer, it's like over $2,000, I'd say, like for any of them that are reliable. But here, these are more economical light meters that people have classically used, especially orchid growers. They've used these, like this one on the upper right, for a long time. And they, to make them, well, because they're mass produced, they're made more for people's vision in lux, like, say people are looking at photography or looking at like home lighting. They're not intended for PAR spectrum. I actually did find a new meter that is targeted for the PAR spectrum. And that's this one on the bottom, although I've been looking into it and it seems like it's got some quality issues. But we'll come back to this in a little bit and we'll figure out how we can make these things useful, even though we don't measure the metric that's most pertinent to plants. So we're going to talk about specific light sources now. So the first most important one for plants is the way that they evolved, and that is in natural daylight. So you can see a spectrum right here. This is on a clear day. And you can see it falls off a little bit as you get into the red, but it's still pretty flat. I should mention that the PPFD of a direct sunlight is around 2,000 micromoles per second per meter squared. Just keep that in mind as we're going through and talking about different light striking plants in different areas. I also should mention that the PPFD of the sun can rapidly change with geography, time of day, season, local landscape, local weather. I mean, even in places that are less humid. Like I grew up in Arizona, and since there's very little water in the air to interact with light, it actually is about 50% brighter on a sunny day in, say, Tucson than it is on a sunny day like where I'm at now in Texas, just because of how light's interacting with molecules and scattering. So I'll move through the individual light sources pretty quickly. Just take a look. This spectrum is for this T8 fluorescent. This is kind of like the classic shop light that you'd find like in a hardware store or garage. And it's really peaky. It's the way fluorescent, I won't get into the way the fluorescents work actually, but like it just lends itself to having a very peak spectrum like this. And so the PPE on these are like around 0.8 microjoules or micromoles per joule when they're new, but I will say that can drop off pretty quickly as the light is used. I've found for say like a T5 fluorescent, which is like a slightly smaller bulb that's a little bit more efficient. I found that if you use that for like 2 years with a normal photo period you'd use for growing most carnivores, you can get a drop of like 60% output on these. So so say you're like you start out at like this 1.23 number micromoles per joule, but then you can drop well below 1 over time with these guys, unless you change out the bulbs. There's some other newer technologies on the market that are also pretty efficient, but I won't spend much time on them just because they're not really suited for us as hobbyists. You know, these are more for commercial settings where the units are mounted high, like in a greenhouse, maybe a grow tent, or some area with a larger footprint. You know, you would not want to put one of these lights directly, you know, like 12 inches above a sundew or something like that, unless it's maybe like Drosser indica that just like wants to burn or something, because these guys are really, really bright, and they do put out a lot of heat as well. So you often have to run fans through them. Anyways, high pressure sodium is similar to ceramic metal halide. The spectrum is different, but the application is generally the same. Now we come to LEDs. And forget the pun, there's a wide spectrum of LEDs. They range all over the place, from strip lighting, like this one in the center here, to bulbs that are meant to replace fluorescent tubes, other lights that are meant from like generally more large form factor. And then right here at the bottom, we have some lights that are generally for like larger growing operations. But then this one on the left here, we'll talk about that one later. That one is specifically meant as a replacement for T5s. So LED spectra can be all over the place, you know, because these diodes can be tailored to, you know, exactly the wavelength range that you want to illuminate. So say like on the upper left here, this is what I'd call like a balanced spectrum. And then the upper right is like red shifted, so it's more heavy into the red than the blue. Notice there's a blue peak in both of these spectrum. And that is actually a characteristic of most white light LEDs. You have blue light that actually excites these phosphors in the LED, and those phosphors are kind of broad spectrum, and they just kind of they get hit with light, and then they just kind of they get excited, and then they fall down into their relaxed state, and along that way they'll emit light, but like a broad range of light. It's not like a specific wavelength, and that's where you can kind of get this more white evened out spectrum. Than just like a specific LED, which is what we have down in the bottom here. In this case, we have just two LEDs, a blue and a red. And you know, looking at the spectrum, this would give you the blurple type of look that some LEDs have. That, you know, it kind of looks like you're in a rave. They can grow plants well. So right here, this is just some published data on PPE, photosynthetic photon efficiency for a few different light sources. Let's see, take home here is that HPS, you can get up to like 1.72 micromorphs per joule. And then with LEDs, you can have a wide range, even for LEDs that are like well manufactured here, you know, like you've got everywhere from like around like a little over 1 to some LEDs that are like 2.5 or above in terms of efficiency. And so these are a few other ones I thought that are important to compare here. So we have a strip light LED. I will say if you get strip lights and you're mounting them to like an aluminum channel and you think you're saving money, you're not. I built a few of these over the years thinking that, oh, you know, the LED, just because it says LED, it's efficient. It's not particularly efficient. It's not very good at dissipating heat, as well as just not, you know, overall, you know, like the drivers for the electronics were not particularly efficient either. You're looking at pretty low numbers here, like 0.2, like way lower than a fluorescent light. Like T8s and T5s are kind of the classic form factor for a lot of grow shelves. And you see right here is like 0.84, 1.23. There's some LEDs like on Amazon that I see a lot of people in the community using, like the Vipar Spectra. And I've heard good things about them. I just have no idea how efficient they are. You know, I don't have an integrating sphere to do the measurements on. Yeah, I'd really love to know, actually, or at least take some PPFD measurements on it if I can't like actually get a PPE measurement on it. Also, LED shop lights. I've seen some people just buy some stuff from like Costco and actually get really good results too. But I don't know the efficiency of those. I do know I've tested some LEDs meant to replace T8 bulbs, and those were fairly efficient. They were like in the ballpark of like T5 fluorescent. We already talked about high pressure sodium and ceramic metal halide. I'll say the engineered horticultural LEDs. You know, they're always getting better. I can say that right now they're generally between like 1.7 and 2.5. And you can get a very reliable fixture there. And like, you know, I'm referencing mainly like the brands that would actually go through the testing here. So like I list a few of them down here. You know, like some of the big ones are like PL Lighting Systems, Fluence, Philips. I'm actually coming up with my own LED line that will be rolling out very soon. I've been working with some manufacturers in Asia for quite a long time now. There's some other places like Helispec and Hubble Industries as well. All right, so this might be the most relevant to everybody here. It's like I've talked about a lot of technical stuff so far, but right here are the levels that you actually would want to hit for specific genera of carnivorous plants. You can see there's actually a wide range. I've tested a very wide range of LEDs for many different plants, you know, and it's just yeah, I think. Let's see. Yeah, it surprised me that like some plants seem like there was like a factor of 10 difference between what they would tolerate at the low end and what they would tolerate at the high end. So like Nepenthes, you know, obviously like the lower light you're using, the more elongated the leaves may be, as well as the less colorful they'll be. And then when you get into the upper range, they can get really colored, but in some cases they're going to be stressed out with that amount of light. And these ones down here, like upright Sarracenia, like Flava, Leucophila, Aleda, those ones, I only did seedlings so far just because they get so big, it's really hard to get the geometry right for like the testing, which most of the time was under my greenhouse benches. So I just raised seedlings that way, but I'm very hopeful that with these LEDs, we'll actually be able to grow upright Sarracenia under lights. That's something that's well, I don't know. I grew up using T12, so that was never even a thought. And then yeah. Oh, and also this assumes there's a 12 to 14 hour photo period for all these ranges. So I mentioned there's that I might show a chart. This chart right here maps the measurements in Lux to measurements in PPFD, which I've been talking about. And the reason it can do that is because you know the spectrum of these guys, so it's kind of easy to know like what the conversion factor is, because the Lux is weighted, you know, also by the amount of power coming through, which varies by where you are in the spectrum. You notice I have not included LEDs here because LEDs have such a wide range of different spectra. Like I could give a calibration factor that is completely off, that would be kind of meaningless. Anyways, I'm always trying to test new LEDs, you know, and publishing more data on this stuff. I talk a little bit about thermal concerns. You know, when I know we're talking about lighting here, but you know, heat is an integral part of everything. It's kind of where energy just ends up if it's not you know, being used for some type of work. So I should say that a high percentage of light is turned into heat. You know, I would say in our setup, it's probably well over 90%. Like, I know, like, I was reading a theoretical paper that said that, you know, photosynthesis, you know, in ideal conditions can have like a 27% yield, like of the light that hits the leaf, like 27% of it is actually getting used. That's under like ideal lighting conditions. But in our setups, the truth is, you know, most of the setup is hitting the pot or soil or other things, and not necessarily a leaf surface. Or I don't know, maybe some of my growing setups where everything's completely overgrown, maybe it hits it a lot more. But I'm just going to assume that like 90% of it is not hitting or is not getting converted into anything but heat. So if you think about that, like an air conditioner uses about 1 watt of power to remove 3 watts of heat. These lights are continually producing heat. So lights can be used to warm warm up a grow space or the local area around a grow space. I know there's some places in Europe, for example, that refuse to use LEDs because they want to use the less efficient metal halides to heat the greenhouse, and that's just kind of how they've always done it. But for many carnivores, we want it cool and bright, especially like highland species or like Darlingtonia. We're always fighting the heat. And so the cooler we can get, usually the healthier a plant will grow. At least for me in Texas and all the other places I've lived in Arizona and California. So we're always taking into account what the leaf temperature is at where it's growing. So I'll say that inefficiencies in lights, they can hit you twice. Once for the loss in efficiency of the light itself, and then whatever that loss of efficiency is, in terms of power, you pay another 1/3 of it for the cooling costs if you're you have some type of cooling in your house or your greenhouse. So I wanted to do a 1-year cost comparison, kind of detailing a Venus flytrap grow shelf, which is like we'll say it's 4 foot by 2 foot. We're using like the classic 54 watt T5 lights. So that's 216 watts of the light, and that translates to a PPF of 266. The yearly cost with a 14-hour photo period and like a rate of like 15 cents a kWh would be like $166. And then on top of that, you add the amount of cooling costs, just assuming that, all of that extra energy needs to be cooled down by an air conditioner. You need to replace the bulbs every year, so that's an extra $40. So total cost of $261. So we can do the same thing, we can normalize by just saying, well, let's find an LED that's 106 watts but has a PPE of 2.5. So it's got the same PPF as those fluorescent fixtures. So in this case, the yearly cost for that would be $81. There's still a cooling cost, but it's less. So it's $27. Total cost of that setup would be $108 a year. And then on top of that, you get the added bonus of you're not generating as much heat around the plants, locally. So maybe the plants will be happier. Even if you've got an air-conditioned area, there's always these local environments around the plants where it takes a little bit for that heat to dissipate and reach an equilibrium with the rest of the room. So now we're
Drew?
Yeah.
Real quick, we had a question about where you're publishing data. You mentioned earlier that you publish some data when you test the stuff.
Yeah, so I was actually going to publish all that on my website.
Very cool. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right here, we're looking at specific plant characteristics. And I just wanted to show a Nepenthes that got too much light. It didn't mean that it's dying. I think it still looks pretty attractive. But there's some characteristics that you can often see, like when you're judging, whether or not a plant is getting too much or too little light. So we see that the leaves are a little bit more yellow in this case. We actually see that the picture size is increasing, which usually is, at least tells me that like maybe, that it's just getting too much light. It's not necessarily that the plant is unhealthy. And the pictures will often get more colorful. You see the leaf shrink a bit, which makes sense, in terms of energy. If the plant's getting plenty of light, it doesn't need to produce these big leaves to capture more of it when it can do the same with smaller leaves. You often see spotting in the leaves, especially in Nepenthes. They all have this endophytic fungus that gets expressed during times when the plant is stressed. In some species, it comes out almost all the time, but particularly when they're overexposed, like truncata, and sometimes like this is a ventricosa hybrid, so those as well. In some species, it manifests differently. Like in Bicalcarata, you'll see black spots whenever they're overexposed. And then the other characteristic, which is not a bad thing, but like you have these like leaves that are usually stiffer and thicker. That could be for a variety of reasons. One of them being that if they're getting a lot of light, they may actually be transpiring quickly as well, because there's a lot of light, so it's a warmer environment. So they're just they're trying to have this thick leaf to deal with the lower humidity and higher local temps. So Nepenthes veitchi, I've noticed this species is particularly sensitive to its light levels. You can get a whole bunch of different phenotypes in veitchi, like even the same plant of veitchi, just by playing around with the light levels. So like here, we're on the lower end, which I would consider suitable for veitchi. Like this one, we're at 40 micromoles per second per meter squared. And you see that the veitchi, like the leaves are very green, but you'll see that the pitchers are smaller than the leaves. The leaf size is increasing, which is usually a good sign, but the pitchers aren't as big as they would be under stronger light. You'll see at the bottom here that you see both pitcher size and leaf size increasing, which is a good thing. These, at the PPFD of around 100 micromoles per second per meter squared, I see the leaf is not quite as green as I would generally like it to be. So it might use a little bit less light, ideally, but in general, like this is a pretty happy plant that's going to continue increasing in size. If you overexpose a plant, Nepenthes, especially veitchi, too much, it's going to stunt, and it's just not going to grow particularly well. Even if you feed it, even if all the other conditions are right, you can really make it stunt it. And you see right here, like the upper right corner, this plant was getting a lot of light. And you can see the older leaves are larger than the newer leaves. And that's not a great thing, if you want the plant to get grower. If you wanted to stay dwarf, that's fine. You can play games with that, and you can be feeding it continuously, so it's still healthy and it's getting nutrients. It's got that look where it's going to stay smaller in stature, more compact, with really colorful pitchers. I've definitely noticed that certain species, truncata as well, are really going to tell you right away what they like and what they don't like in terms of lighting. So next slide, I did want to mention that I've been working for quite a while on some LEDs that I hope will really help other growers out. These are meant to kind of be a replacement for the fluorescents that we use on our growing shelves. These are really efficient. I use some of the highest efficiency ballasts and LEDs that are out there. And then there's a lot of different form factors that will have different PPFD numbers for many applications, growing everything from like lower light species and orchids to like really high light species. It comes in like a standard length of 4 foot. And I'm trying to make sure that the light is as uniform as possible on all units. And all the data I will provide that will make sure that you have a good idea of what you're getting and what type of lighting system you're going to need for your setup. All the units are IP50 or IP65 water resilient, and there's 2-year warranty, and it's all white light spectrum, no blurple, so you wouldn't it's something you could have in the house. Anyways, that's all I had.